Okay, ladies, I think many of you are going to relate to this story, which is about 10 years ago, I came across this book called Adrenal Fatigue by James Wilson. And I read this very long list of symptoms of what adrenal fatigue could cause, and basically, checked off every single thing that he was talking about and decided, oh my gosh, that's it. I've got adrenal fatigue. Well, I'm sure many of you probably went through that same process many years ago as well. And maybe even recently where you've heard of this term adrenal fatigue and decided, yes, this is what's happening to you. Well, we now know that it's not that simple and that adrenal fatigue is really not the right term even to be using, because that's not what's happening in our body. So today I've got one of the guys that I have followed for a very long time and really considered to be one of the top experts on adrenal fatigue, if we want to call it that, or we'll just say adrenal problems. And that's Dr. Joel Rosen. He is the founder of the Truth About adrenalfatigue.com and creator of Your Adrenal Fix podcast. His mission is to expose the truth about adrenal fatigue, burnt out men and women, so that we can empower 100 million people to go from exhausted to energized. The truth is, adrenal fatigue goes deeper than just adrenals. Dr. Joel teaches stressed out adults that recovery requires this understanding. With Your Adrenal Fix, healing really involves repairing your broken down HPA axis. Otherwise known as your stress response system, restoring your circadian rhythm, understanding the impact that all environmental stressors have on the body, and how your genetic uniqueness all combine together, resulting in your fatigue that can be tested, measured, and approved upon. You can find Joel at thetruthaboutadrenalfatigue.com. So welcome, Joel, to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, for having me. I can relate with I happened to read a book called Why Do I Have Thyroid Symptoms Even Though My Blood Tests Are Normal? And this was after graduating from chiropractic college with my wife pregnant with twins and over $250,000 of student loan, and moving from to not just California, but then from California to Florida, opening my own practice. And I was tired, exhausted, burnt out, and looking for answers because I didn't know what was going on. And someone bought me that book, and I sat on my desk for a while, and I finally read it. And all of the bullet points of adrenal fatigue, which I'd never heard of, described me to a T. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I have this background, I mean, I had an exercise physiology background, I had a psychology background, I just graduated from chiropractic college, and I never heard of this. And on top of that, it's a stress-based illness based on the demands and the late nights that we keep and all of the to-do lists and caffeine and sugary foods. And it's an epidemic, if not a major challenge. So I thought, I got to learn more about this. And it's just been one wild journey after the next.
Wow. Yes. I remember hearing your story on a podcast once going, oh yeah, you definitely had it hit. You had it hit hard for you with twins and going to school and having that dad, and you really experienced it, but you ended up pulling yourself out. But did you at first, like with the book that you read, did that help you to pull out of it? Or did you find that, okay, this doesn't help, now I'm going to find out what is going to help with it?
It's a good question. I mean, I read Dr. Wilson's book as well, and I think it was a great primer. And obviously over the years, things changed so rapidly. I don't remember exactly what was in there, but it did give me some good insight in terms of making sure that we're aware of blood sugar. A lot of people aren't aware of the blood sugar connection with adrenal health, obviously stimulants, the gut health, and if we might react to certain foods, and gluten's always an offender. So it did raise some connections that I hadn't considered, Karen, but I think there was the philosophy of small meals more frequently, which I think we know by now that's not a healthy way to go about it. And there's just so many other insights that we have with how much circadian rhythm controls all our cells in the body, not just your HPA axis, like having cortisol be high in the morning and low at night. That's a relationship to circadian rhythm. We know that so many of our systems run on a clock. And then on top of that, now we know about this thing called autophagy, which was discovered in 2017, was known about before that, but that's really how our body cleanses and removes old cells that need to be cleared out when we're not using them anymore. And if we're on a caloric excess, that won't allow us to do that. And so we know so much more now, and it needs to be used not as the gospel, but more as a template to give us insight. It was definitely helpful, but I think what happens is the information changes and people don't change with it. And then we have people that aren't getting solutions. So you got to look at it as, what kind of information is this going to give me that's helpful? And am I open to the idea that it's not the end all be all, and not just because I read it and someone else gets better doesn't necessarily I will, or just because they don't doesn't necessarily mean I won't. You want to take the good parts out and leave the rest. And that's how it should be approached with everything.
Yeah. And so can you explain just the kind of the old model of adrenal fatigue and what actually is happening in the brain?
Yeah. I mean, so the old model, or just the way the term was originated, was in the Hans Selye, the general adaptation theory. And a lot of people take that in college. I remember taking that, and I was proud that I grew up in Toronto. Hans Selye had immigrated to Canada and was a professor in Canadian colleges. And so it talks about the three phases of a stress response. It talks about the alarm phase, it talks about the resistance phase, and then the exhaustion phase. And the alarm phase is when your heightened alarm system, sort of like you call 911, and then they dispatch the first responders. That's the alarm system. The resistance phase is the ability to continue doing that over and over again, and you build up a resistance to those stressors. You're able to manage them. And then the exhaustion phase is you don't manage them. And the term exhaustion really doomed that term, because exhaustion doesn't exist in the medical realm. It doesn't exist in peer-reviewed journals, and it doesn't exist in the curriculum. And what does exist is insufficiency, or Addison's disease. So there already was a diagnosis. I mean, he coined his term in the 50s, and in the 1850s or 1870s, there was already a well-established condition called adrenal insufficiency, or Addison's disease, where the adrenals don't mount enough cortisol to deal with stress. And so it's insufficient. When you say exhaustion, you get that connotation that they're not producing a baseline amount. And when you give the people that say they have this exhaustion phenomena that test to see if it's going to make enough cortisol, I'd say 99 times out of 100, it passes, because it's a very rare condition. So what happened was doctors end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater and said, well, if you're not actually black or white, there's no shades of gray. There's no such thing as this. And then there's been a lot of controversy in terms of the Endocrine Society saying, hey, look out for doctors that support this and say that this is a thing. And plus, it's not continued in the education and research. And what we've known is, so that was the old model, is that for those that didn't believe in the fact that it can only be black and white, that there's shades of gray, they use the term loosely, adrenal fatigue, where you're under so much stress that even though it may not produce a minimal amount to be positive for Addison's, it's floundering and it's challenged. And that's where the new model actually shows that the majority of the challenges that occur with that signaling system, the brain signals to the adrenals and the adrenals mount a response, that's not the only thing that happens. The immune system is involved, the digestive system, the fight or flight. The body goes into cell danger to make sure that it has enough nutrients to survive, and at the expense of other things. But what also happens is the majority of the changes take place outside of the adrenal gland. So what happens is you get those very dogmatic, not willing to listen doctors that are fixed on what they learned in school, and only to know that they were wrong for the wrong reasons, because there are so many things that happen outside of the adrenal glands that even if it is normal and you're saying, well, sorry, you have a problem, you're normal, they now are sort of being, I guess, having this consequence of learning the reality of, oh, maybe we were wrong. There's all these other things that go wrong, that the cortisol can be completely fine, and yet they're still dealing with a, if you call it a HPA axis dysfunction, but they're still dealing with a problem with stress and the way that stress has impacted their body. And ultimately they're fatigued, they're exhausted, they're burnt out. But as we teach more and more, the reality is that all of that means to say is you're not making enough cellular energy at the cellular level for your body to be able to keep up with the demand. And as a result, your body makes choices of what it's going to do. And that's why it's so multi-system in terms of brain fog, joint pains, hormone imbalances, pure energy through the day. Your rhythm is off, you're up at night and you're down in the morning. So many things that are involved, because whatever requires energy in your body, which is everything, and you don't have the ability to do it, you're going to have some consequences for that.
Right. Oof, yes. It's so vast, hey? Like, it's so much more than that. Oh, you're just stressed out and you've got some adrenal insufficiency. There's so much more to it. And I think that people don't realize all of these things that can impact the adrenal system and how your body's processing stress, because we not only just have everyday stressors, but things like infection can downregulate cortisol. Things like you said, blood sugar will affect. Talk to us about that. I want to know more about how is it that blood sugar and dysregulation of that system can affect the cortisol and the adrenal system.
Yeah, and it's a two-way relationship. So let's just not even talk about what we're eating and how often or how much, but just with the response of stress. So when we do have stress, our central nervous system, basically everything from the outside and the inside gets signaled in the body as something going on, and then your brain signals to your rest of your tissues and organs like an orchestra, like it should. Hey, divert attention over here, let's divert it away from there. And the old theory is that the fight or flight, the survival mechanisms will take the priority, and it still works that way in terms of survival or fight or flight, where you're not concerned about digestion and you're not concerned about reproduction, you're concerned about survival. So that's where you have the blood flow increase to your muscles and your brain, and just being able to survive. But that is considered regulated by cortisol and adrenaline and all the adrenal hormones that come with that. And those are considered glucocorticoids, which means they help to signal a response in the body using glucose as the fuel source. And so by definition, cortisol is catabolic. It liberates or breaks down or makes available glucose. So it's going to drive up your glucose initially for that bout of energy that you need right away. And when you do that repetitively, that glucose up, glucose down, glucose up, glucose down puts a big load on insulin. And then over time, you're constantly signaling the fight or flight response because of just daily activities and stressors that we're not aware of, what we eat, what we breathe, what we drink, what we think. The environment's so stressing to us that causes that cortisol to release. And that cortisol causes the insulin to release. And then we start to develop metabolic issues, metabolic syndrome. So high triglycerides and cholesterol and fatty liver and your liver enzymes and stuff like that. So that's not even talking about what you're eating. That's just talking about being aware of what stress is doing to you from a blood sugar standpoint. But then, of course, what we are eating will spike that even further. If we're eating lots of carbs, lots of processed foods, lots of rancid oils, adulterated stuff. I mean, it's everywhere. And that's going to drive up your glucose even more. Not to say that a person doesn't eat well, but usually they don't have essential fatty acids at the level they need to because they've been vilified and been told that they're bad. and or they're not eating enough protein, or maybe they're eating way too much protein, and that can spike glucose as well too. So I look at it as there's the stress physiology glucose side of things, and then there's the dietary intake side of things, and ultimately that's going to impact your stability of glucose. And 88% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy because of this reason. So it plays a big part. And when we're working with our coaching clients, Karen, we make sure that we're giving them the glucose ketone monitor so that they could start to calibrate what they think their blood sugar is doing and what it really is, because a lot of them will be what they consider reactive hypoglycemic, but really they're hyperglycemic, they're insulin resistant, they're not getting glucose inside the cell, and they're developing these emotional unhealthy connections with food, and they're not being satiated, and the chemicals aren't signaling back, and they need more glucose to get into the cell to signal more insulin, and it just becomes this vicious snowball effect, if you will.
Yeah. And what about low cortisol? Does that, because I understand, like, high cortisol, you're going to get that rush of blood sugar because you got to fight or flight.
Right.
What about when we're in that chronic state of low cortisol production? Does that affect blood sugar?
Yeah. I mean, I look at it as it's always dysregulated, right?
Yeah.
So it's either, I guess you could say it's textbook high, textbook low, or somewhere in between. And that doesn't mean it's relegated to that denomination forever. It's always moving. So I look at it, it's number one, it's dysregulated cortisol. It's either high or low, or it's not at the right times, or it's not available in terms of there's too many binding proteins, so there's none of it that's free, or there's another inability to get it to be available, it's being deactivated. There's a lot of mechanisms that we now learned that besides the adrenal gland not making enough cause that cortisol to not be used effectively, that it is low, that it's not there. But usually I'll explain to someone, having a high hormone and a low hormone oftentimes lead to the same road, just a different detour to get there. So I'll give you an example of high insulin. High insulin is going to lower blood glucose, but over time, it's going to cause insulin resistance because that insulin is no longer being listened to. But the same thing happens with low insulin over time, right? Because then you're not getting glucose out of the cell, and then that glucose will create metabolic issues because it needs to be taken care of. And that's when triglycerides are made. So it leads to a lot of the same destinations if you have a high hormone or a low hormone. So low cortisol can create challenges. It's usually, there's other things like you'll start to make more adrenaline, or you'll start to, I guess you'll crave sugary foods more, or caffeine or stimulants to make up the difference in terms of what you're not getting. But the reality is all of those are slightly downstream from the main problem, which is your body is not using oxygen for energy production. That's the main problem. And whether that's been going on for so long that it causes a lot of cortisol to be elevated, or that's been going on even longer and it causes a lot of cortisol to be depleted, the bottom line is the main problem is you're not using oxygen to make energy effectively at the level you need to. Does that make sense?
Yep. For me, it does. Yeah. Where does the adrenaline come in? Like once in this chain of reactions that's happening in the adrenal system, if we're going from that kind of high state, high cortisol, adrenal, hyperactivity, and then we start to downregulate that cortisol production, where does adrenaline come into this picture? Because I've heard before, like when you get low cortisol, you'll actually start running more on adrenaline, which is that cause of that wired but tired feeling, because you've got no cortisol, you're exhausted, but then you'll have insomnia because you've got this elevated adrenaline. Is there truth to that?
Well, yeah, let me just take a step back for a second. So if you just come up with the thought process of my body is not using oxygen for me, it's not delivering oxygen to my cells to be able to make energy effectively. And I'm required to then be a glucose burner and use kindling and bark and shrubs to make energy versus igniting a log. Think of that first. But back to your original question, what happens is as soon as the stress response hits, it becomes a neurological signal that's immediate. Like think about the unfortunate circumstance of almost getting in a car accident and swerving and that immediate adrenaline rush that you get, or that shortness of breath. That was a nervous system, immediate neurochemical that was sent from your brain to the adrenals, the inner part, the medulla, or the meaty part, that releases those catecholamines, those excitatory neurotransmitters. Then what happens is moments later, the pituitary sends ACTH to the adrenals to release cortisol and kind of shift gears to get it back down to regulation. So usually what happens is the adrenaline happens first, and then the cortisol helps to bring us back down. So thinking of it from a different paradigm, think of it as a broken clutch in your standard vehicle. And if the cortisol is low, you're not able to get it out of gear and it's revving its engine. So that might give you some more ahas with, okay, I can sense that my adrenaline system, I'm in that wired and tired because I'm not able to get out of that. Another thing that happens a lot of times is people that can be thought of as having low cortisol. Again, I'd say dysregulated cortisol, but even before that, I'd say you're not making energy at the level you need to, and this is what's happening. And that way we're not reductionistically saying, oh, it's low, we got to bring it up, or, oh, it's high, we got to bring it down. We got to fix the main problem and let the intelligence of the body do what it needs to do with it. But as far as that goes, a lot of the times what will happen is someone that's considered that has low cortisol, they will wake up several times throughout the night, versus someone that has high cortisol typically has a more difficult time falling asleep, or they have both. They might not fall asleep and not stay asleep the whole night. But when you think about low cortisol, again, if we're trying to sleep through the night and the cortisol falls, or the cortisol's up there to be a safety net to make sure that that blood sugar doesn't fall too low, then your body will release adrenaline to sort of wake you up, and you don't have that cortisol to switch gears again and regulate the body. So think of it like that more than anything else, because then once you start to make that paradigm shift of my cells are not respiring, meaning they're not using oxygen for energy production, and I've gotten so depleted that sleep is a problem, regulating my temperature when it's cold out is a problem, doing my hormones and having them be balanced is a problem. All of these consequences of not making enough income, like think of it as your business. Like I don't have enough income, so I'm not hiring more staff. In fact, I'm probably laying off some staff. I'm not doing as much advertising. I'm starting to really contract when I don't have that income that's coming in my business that I need to not only put food on my plate and keep the power on, but do things to grow the business. And then as it gets worse and worse and worse and worse, now you're really making hard choices. Like, okay, is it food or is it power? When that happens, that's where you see the POT syndrome, autonomic syndrome. You can't regulate your body temperature. Your blood pressure isn't able to mount a response. So you get lightheaded and faint when you stand up, or you can't, your heart rate, as soon as you have a stress, you can't manage it and it's not able to slow down. That's when you've really lost a lot of income, if you will. I'm not thinking about cortisol, or is it high, is it low, is your adrenaline high? I mean, it's good to know that, but reality is I'm really behind on the rent here. I gotta make some energy.
Right. Like, so you're not like going, oh, we're just going to put this supplement in to try and raise our cortisol. You're looking at it from that big point of view going, what's underneath all of this that we can start supporting this entire system to work better, because it will know how to work better if we do that.
Right. And that's not to say you're just going to leave it to chance for the body. I had this conversation with someone else the other day where the premise is you got to get your body making energy more effectively by using oxygen. And so you're controlling your oxygen consumption rate. So your VO2 max is how much oxygen you consume in 1 minute, but your oxygen consumption rate is over the course of a day. When you need to make more energy, you need to use more oxygen to make that energy. And if we get carried away with our thoughts or our emotions, that's going to increase your demand for using oxygen, that you don't have a good oxygen using machine. It's going to deplete your limited amount of reserves that you have. So that's why I tell people, you got to really focus on the emotional component. And when stress happens, to not let the mind get carried away and breathe through it and put a different purpose and meaning on it, and thinking about how is this for my best good versus this is not fair, and because that can make things even worse. So that needs to be addressed. But to your point, it's not just going to fix itself if you have mold, or you have heavy metals, or you have EBV that continues to reactivate, or you have major permeable gut lining membrane breakdown. Those things still need to be addressed in time when you've already addressed the foundations of your energy producing machine, so that you're not inefficient at your body's ability to make energy. And then you could start loading it up with additional support so that you can take on the other things that have transpired because of that lack of energy. But yes, you do need to make it so that once the body is able to make more energy on its own effectively, and it's not creating waste products and so forth, now that alone by itself will go very, very far as well.
So break down, when you're saying like energy, what are you meaning by that? Like, because that's such a broad, like, we want to give the body more energy. It's like, okay, well, how do we do that? And what are we talking about there?
Yeah. I mean, this is where, if it's, I don't mean to get too scientific beyond that, but from high school chemistry, this is where you're actually talking about ATP production, right? Okay. So ATP is our unit of energy. And the easiest way to think of that is food plus air, food plus oxygen equals ATP plus water. So really, how well you convert the food you eat with the air you breathe into ATP and water. And we do that through a process called cellular respiration. And there's two kinds of cellular respiration, anaerobic or aerobic. Anaerobic doesn't require oxygen, and we're using glycolysis to split sugar, and we make 2 ATPs, but it requires 1. So it's very inefficient at making energy. Or we make the products that would go on in glycolysis into aerobic cellular respiration and make up to 36 ATP. So you're making 18 times more energy when you're efficient at using oxygen for energy production versus using glucose for energy production. You're either using glucose anaerobically, or you're using glucose aerobically along with healthy fats and proteins to make energy at a way more yield, if that makes sense.
So protein and fats are going to give us more of an oxygen, like more oxygen in the cell, like more energy compared to glucose.
It's not so much that. It's more of the, no, it's a good point. A lot of the proteins get converted to glucose, and then that gets put into the glycolysis factory, if you will. But the reality is that's where our conversation beforehand with having bioavailable copper and having the right mineral balances to be able to use that electron transport chain that allows those oxygen to produce hydrogen and water to be produced and ATP to be produced, because you have the right constitution or constituents and the minerals to be able to do that. And when we're under stress and our diet and everything else in between, it is sort of the perfect storm of not allowing us to really get into that cellular respiration aerobically. And a lot of people will say it's a mitochondrial thing. That's the new term. It's a mitochondrial dysfunction. And that's true. Your body's mitochondria is where the power plants of the cell are, where ATP production happens with oxygen. And that's where electrons are being bounced to be able to make ATP. but that really requires optimal oxygen and copper status to be able to do that. And that's a whole other rabbit hole. But suffice it to say, the best way I would look at it is, think of it as your body is efficient at making energy with oxygen. And if you're not using oxygen for energy, you're using oxygen to create free radicals. And if you're tired, you have that as a problem. I say it's like your body should be using oxygen for energy production, or your oxygen for energy destruction, if you will. And it's like, I say, the analogy I use is, if you're not using oxygen for energy, you're using it for energy. I guess it just destroys energy. So think of it as, instead of working for me for the week and then me giving you a paycheck, at the end of the week, I'm going to give you an invoice. That's what happens when you're not using oxygen for you. Does that make sense? Did I break up on you?
Okay, so explain then the oxygen piece. Like when you're saying oxygen, I'm just thinking of the air we breathe. So if we're when you're saying if we're not using this oxygen properly, we're oxidizing, which I get that. But when you're
that's where iron comes in, right? Because iron makes hemoglobin, or it helps to make hemoglobin, and then the hemoglobin is what binds oxygen in the red blood cells, and then that's what's being transported to all your tissues to use that oxygen. But if we don't have the necessary ingredients to move that iron out of tissues, which is bioavailable copper, and this is kind of getting a lot deeper quicker than I had anticipated, but if we don't have bioavailable copper in our body, and the reason we wouldn't is because the minerals are devoid of them, glyphosate stripped them, high fructose corn syrup gets rid of it, some additional supplements like zinc and molybdenum and multivitamins and vitamin D and calcium can deplete the bioavailable copper, and there's genetic susceptibilities, and there's iron enriched foods and synthetic bees in our environment as well, that creates the perfect storm of not allowing iron to move out of tissues. So if iron is not being transported out of tissues and being able to get transported in the blood, then that oxygen will meet the iron in the tissues. Instead of being transported and moved and used to produce energy, it will oxidize and create free radicals.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. I was going there. I was going to the iron thing because so every, you test I do all this lab work, and it's like every woman has low ferritin and low iron stores. And so it's, very common for women to go on iron supplementation, but we're not considering that we have plenty of iron possibly in our tissues, but it's not being used. Is that correct?
Yeah, and exactly what we just said. I mean, 32 to 33% of the Earth's core and what's in the Earth is iron. And that was with the book Cure Your Fatigue with Morley, which we talked about earlier, that I wasn't aware of that level of iron being available, but iron can store in your tissues up to 10 times more than it can in the blood. And when you don't have the bioavailable copper to move the iron out of tissues, it does store in the blood. And as a result, it's not getting moved out of the blood into your red blood cells, and it can look like it's depleted. And when you look at like it's depleted,
then it can feel like you're depleted, right?
You in a way you are, right? Because you really are not getting oxygen moving to make energy.
Okay.
Right. But you're not necessarily depleted in iron in your body. And when you take iron, it's not going to fix why the iron isn't getting to where it needs to do. You're just going to put more of something that's not working effectively, work even less effectively. So, yeah, that's one of those things where ferritin is what's considered an intracellular storage protein. In English, what that means is it shouldn't be in the blood. So a lot of researchers feel that low ferritin is normal for us. We should have 0 amounts of ferritin to begin with. And actually, I talked to Morley, and he said once we started to put enrichment of iron in our food sources, I think in the 70s or early 70s, somewhere around that time, we used to use hemoglobin as our surrogate marker for iron status, because 70% of our iron is in our hemoglobin. But once we started to fortify our foods and give us so much amounts of iron in our food servings, we started using ferritin as a marker of how much extra iron are we getting? Is it too much? And we started using, so now we look at iron as healthy levels of ferritin reflect healthy iron stores, which is not the case. Healthy levels of iron are in other markers like serum iron. For women, it should be approximately 100. And so sometimes I'll see women in the 40s or 50s. I know right away that I don't think right away, okay, you have an iron deficiency. I think already you have an energy production problem. You're not oxidizing effectively. You're using oxygen against you instead of for you. That's not allowing your bioavailable copper to move your iron out of tissues, and thereby it gets stuck, and that starts to oxidize, and that creates, instead of making energy, that creates an expense, and that creates more problems than it's helping. And as a result, that can then create major other challenges, decreased immune systems problems, viral load reactivations, overgrowth of microbials. I'm not even looking at HPA axis at this point, right? I mean, we're not thinking about adrenals at that point. No.
Wow. I love this, Joel. Oh my gosh. And it's not as simple as let's just all run out and start taking copper.
No, it's not, because, and there's the problem with that is there's two forms. Like the thing that's so amazing about copper, and this will really bring out my nerdiness, is that it's got an extra electron. So it's got two available electrons to lose, and usually there's one. So mercury is another item on the periodic table that can lose two electrons. So it's it can create a lot of radicals in the body, because it can lose an electron twice. When it loses an electron, it becomes a free radical. But what happens is, a lot of the times the copper that we get is already reduced. It's lost its electron already. So it's not being used as the bioavailable is what we're talking about, where it's able to actually, because what it does is not only moves iron out of tissues, it helps to clean the exhaust. So when you make ATP, and you do it through glucose production, or you even do it through oxygen using pathways, you're going to spill off a little bit of rust, or a little bit of exhaust, if you will, a little bit of smoke. And the copper in the ceruloplasm, which is a whole other word, helps to clean that rust, or that free radicals. And when you don't have enough bioavailable copper and or ceruloplasm, your body's making more exhaust than it is ATP. And that's creating a lot more problems. So you want to make sure you're creating a very clean fuel, and you want to clean the emissions, if you will, other thing that copper does.
So if you take copper, it's already, and it's missing one of the electrons, it's basically going to be
It's oxidized. It's oxidized already. It's not therapeutically effective. And I think that's where you do hear of people that have copper toxicity, because they're getting non-bioavailable copper in their supplements, and that's not allowing it's not getting inside the cell. It's already oxidized. And so not all copper forms are created equal. And typically I'll have people look online there's a site called, and I think I told this to someone else on a podcast, it's called nutritiondata.self.gov, nutritiondata.self.gov. And if you can do a nutrient search. So I'll have people search for foods that have copper in it. And typically you're going to come up with organ meats, right? That's what you're going to come up with. But you're also going to come up with mollusks and seafoods and stuff like that. And then I believe mushrooms are high in copper. So I really like the idea of getting food sources for copper. And then, of course, beef liver is really great for copper. There's a couple of proprietary names that I use for copper as well. But yeah, I don't think you just want to, like, I'm pretty much a copper snob when I see a supplement that's got copper in it, because I know it's not going to be in its bioavailable form.
Right. So we want to look for it in a whole food source.
Correct.
Yes.
Exactly.
And,
Yes.
and we can all use, so if we see that somebody has low iron stores, low ferritin, then would it be safe to say that instead of saying get on a bunch of iron supplements, that more so get on some whole food sources of bioavailable copper?
Yes and no. I mean, you want to get more ideas as to why and what else, right? So a lot of problems can be that your vitamin D levels storage are too high and compared to vitamin A. So ideally, you may have a 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 ratio of your vitamin A to your vitamin D. If your vitamin D is 2-to-1 higher than your A, then that's going to make it really hard for your iron to get out of your tissues and your bioavailable copper to be there. So you would want to make those changes. You may want to look at hemoglobin and transferrin and copper and ceruloplasmin and serum iron to get an idea where else are the problems along the assembly line being broken down. But with that being said, I still think that you want to get mineral dense foods, a mineral blend, animal organ meats. If you don't like those, maybe desiccated. I mean, the root cause protocol has a whole stop these supplements, start those supplements type of thing that you can do right away. And that's really nice. That's a turnkey thing that you can make available to the listeners. It's a downloadable PDF that they readily share, as long as you give recognition to that they've come up with that. So I like to use that as a stop with the iron supplements, stop with the storage D supplements or the synthetic Ds, stop with the multivitamins because they're going to have synthetic things in there, stop with the synthetic Bs, stop with other things, and then start with perhaps like a whole food C versus a synthetic ascorbic C. Start with more magnesium, start with maybe an adrenal cocktail that has a whole food C, potassium and sodium, but it has a nice list of things to start and things to stop. And that's a really good way than just say, okay, I'm going to take more bioavailable copper and hope that that fixes some of the other ratios that I really want to sift out and figure out what's going on.
Nice. Yeah, perfect. And all of this, of course, can affect our adrenal function.
Yeah, I mean, again, all of it is a two-way relationship, right? Because if you think about, we initially started with stress is going on over and over and over again, whether it's mental, psychological, emotional, physical, relationships, all of the above. And that signals to your brain and signals to your, not just your HPA axis, your thyroid, your sex hormones, your immune system. A lot of things are going on at the same time. But the HPA axis is one of them, and the whole cortisol being released and then being made available and then being deactivated or not, and then being signaled back. There's so many mechanics that go into that. So that's being activated when you're under stress, and that's saying, hey, make more energy. We need more surplus of ATP so that we can give to the cooling system of the body, or it's to give to the heart rate centers of the body, whatever places in the body that need that immediate available source of ATP to do this thing that the clutch does and shifts gears once that adrenaline kind of gets released and buys us that first 10 to 30 seconds of immediate sort of like lift the car off my child release and then kind of come back to earth kind of thing.
Yeah. So it can be struggling in wanting to make energy, but if there's a lot of cellular danger, it will also try to preserve the energy, correct?
Right. And obviously the longer it goes on, the more, think about that engine that's not working well and you're working it really hard. At some point, you keep working it, it's going to cease at some level, right? So it really do behoove you to to get closer and closer to the root of the problem. That's why you see these people that aren't getting better. Like I take ashwagandha, I take licorice root, I take prednisone, I take hydrocortisone, I take
adrenal glandulars.
All of the above. And they're not to say they're not helpful. I think they are, as long as you know, like, okay, this is short term, and we got to really find out like where the breakdown's happening.
Right. And so in your practice, because this is what you do all day long, every day, what are you seeing being the primary driving factors that you just, that are on the top of the list as far as what is causing these adrenal issues and the energy production issues? Is it just mental stress, just lifestyle, or are you seeing that it's more of infections, the heavy metals, the mold?
Yes.
Right? All like the above.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're dealing with in today's day and age, just we're so bombarded. Like, I think just if you look at your computer and you see you have 5 screens open or 5 windows open, and we're multitasking, and we have alerts and notifications, and we don't protect our rhythm, our circadian rhythm. We're accessible 24/7. We're always checking our messages, and we're available, and we're just we're not respectful of our environment in terms of the night and dark, the light cycles, what the earth offers, being connected to like the whole granola, hug a tree and walk around with your feet in the grass and take in good oxygen. I mean, we're plugged in metaphorically, literally all day under fluorescent lights with EMFs and our cell phones on our hips, and food that has no nutrient value whatsoever. If anything, it's adulterated with glyphosates and things you can't even pronounce on there, and modified things in there, and corn syrup in there, to the point where it's no wonder we're not making energy at the level we need to. And then on top of that, we have way more demands to make energy. So I always say, boiling it down, health is really easy. A lot more of the things you need, a lot less of the things you don't need, and you have good health. But the reality is we have a lot less of the good things we need, and we have a lot more of the bad things that we don't need. And that's why you're seeing so many problems. And I do feel that there's viruses that can be endemic, and EBV is something that continues to reactivate. Mold is way worse, I feel, now than it's ever been. 5G is more than 5G, and EMFs as well as 5G, and our cell phones and notifications. And we're just we need to get back to simple times where
you're stressing me out, Joel.
Well, that's the reality. You asked the question, but
I know.
That paints the picture of what we do, right? I mean, it's no wonder I get on the call with someone and it's no mystery. Okay, tell me about your life. Well, I homeschool my 5 kids. I'm a single mom. I was like, okay, you got me already. I already know why we're talking, right? So it's not always a mystery to know, like, okay, well, when was the last time you took a day off? When was the last time you drank enough water and not coffee more? When was the last time that you just got outside with nature? And it's a lot of the free stuff that are the common stuff that are so helpful.
Yeah. And that people have such a hard time doing, I find, it's like the whole self-care thing. People are like, meh. And it's like, no, really, this is what you have to do. You can't supplement your way out of it. The supplements can help, but if you're not changing the reason why you're in that state to begin with, you're beating the dead horse. So I just find that people have a hard time with it. I remember when my journey started, and my journey started with all of these crazy health problems and weight gain and hormone issues. And I was like, what? And I never, ever would have thought I was a stressed out person. I just didn't associate with that. I was like, I'm just a calm, relaxed girl. I'm not stressed out. And then I had my hormones tested, and I did a saliva cortisol test. And I was like bottomed out with my DHEA and my cortisol. And I was like, oh, maybe being a single mother, running my own business, working out 2 hours a day, every day, maybe that is stressful to my body, but it's what everybody's doing. So you just have it in your head that, oh, I'm not stressed out. I'm just doing what everybody else is doing right now, but it's not normal for our physiology. And then on top of that, like you said, the EMF waves, the toxicities, it just piles and piles. So I want to ask, because you're into this, is the genetic piece, which I had never actually, when I saw that on your website, I was like, oh, what? Like I know that there's a cortisol thing when I had my genes tested, but what can our genetics tell us about how we deal with stress?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do I kind of boil it down without getting way more complex? So I look at it as it gives us an idea on how the body deals with stress from a physiology standpoint. And how I even got into the iron and copper was I was finding with almost all my patient base, they had these very common, consistent challenges with using iron, whether they overload it, they overabsorb iron, that's hemochromatosis, or they don't make copper proteins effectively, or they don't convert their beta carotene into vitamin A, or they don't transport iron out of tissues or export it out of tissues or recycle it out of tissues. I'm like, why? That's when I had to learn about more of the whole iron story. And so it gives us ideas as to, is there a challenge with the way that your body deals with stress? Does it make more oxidative stress than the average person? Or does it not turn on the antioxidant systems as well? Or do you have challenges with grains and more potentials for celiac? Or if you get exposed to mold, is that going to make you worse than someone else? Or do you not clear out histamines? Or how are you able to use your B vitamins effectively? Most people think of MTHFR, and that's such a small part of the entire process. EMF exposure, some people are way more sensitive to EMFs or glyphosates. So I want to know on those genetic testing if some people have these weaknesses. Just a really good example is my mentor, his name is Bob Miller, who I use his DNA site for. He's done a Lyme study, a lot of different parts to the Lyme study. And he found that people that were hit hardest with Lyme were the ones that had more challenges with their iron metabolism genes, how well they use iron, if they overabsorb iron, or if they don't recycle iron, or if they don't export iron. Why would that be? Well, same thing is, if you're not using oxygen to make ATP and energy and water, you're using oxygen to oxidize and create inflammation. If you have Lyme disease, you're going to do much worse with that predisposition than someone else, or you'll do much worse with mold, you'll do much worse with EBV or whatever. So I want to know, okay, let's assume you have mold, you have EBV, you have Lyme. Let's look at your genomics and see why you do much worse with that and see how we could support that. So that's why we do genomics, in the sense that it gives us a blueprint on what are the cofactors for an enzyme that you might not have enough nutrients for? What are the environmental things that slow down an enzyme that you may have problems with? What are the actual enzymes that help use this nutrient to convert it to that nutrient that's essential for something else that you don't have, that I can plug in there, so that we can make those little tweaks to, I tell people, you're so close yet so far. You're doing a lot of really great things, but if you don't have that ninth tumbler lock in right position and you had the 8 in position, you could be so close, but you're not going to open it because that ninth one's out of alignment. And I find more often than not, people are a lot closer. And then, like you said, it's lifestyle changes, it's thought processes, it's circadian rhythm stuff, it's community and purpose and connection. And it's all those things, along with some of the small little tweaks that you need to support some of the hiccups in your ability to do things physiologically, that really make the person change that moving of the needle that much more.
Wow. And you must have great success because you're looking at this from such a wide view and taking all of these things into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's one of those things. I will say that some of the best successful outcomes are always going to be the mindset of the person,
Mm.
and knowing that they deserve to be healthy, and even though they have these crazy things that have happened to them that no one should ever have, from a you can't write a movie about it, that they're still open to, I guess, humility, and their life is less serious. I mean, it is in their own moments, but it's not that it's not fair, I'll never get better, this type of attitude. It's more of the, even though like it's been tough, I celebrate the fact that I have this, and I'm grateful for the fact that I have that, and I know that it's not going to be perfect and I'm going to have a new normal, but I'm okay with that. And I need to know what it is and not be dogmatic about I've tried everything and nothing works and it's never going to be good. And this, a lot of the time, it's that whole limbic center, amygdala connection that you put on the stress, that on top of fixing everything else, you got to fix that too, if not fix that first.
Yeah, I that was the biggest game changer for me personally, and with my adrenal system, was learning that I had control over my thoughts and how I felt about situations, and that I could change how I felt and the perception of something. That was like, what? I can do this? And I still practice it. It's something that I think you constantly have to put into practice, because you'll be hit with a situation where your immediate response is that fight or flight, stressed out. Why is this happening to me? Poor me, woe me. And then I'm like, oh, wait, is there a different way I could be looking at this? Could I look at a positive side and not the negative side? And could I change how I'm feeling? And it changed my life knowing how to do that. It really has. Yeah. And I think that's huge. I tell people this all the time, which is you have to change your perception. It's massive.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lifestyle change. I know one of the bigger things that we're teaching now is a lot about diet variation, and not so much what should I be eating. It's more of when should you be eating, and being able to go through some feasting and refueling, and then famining, and if that's a word, and not eating enough food. But that's not an easy thing to do. That's not something one time. That is a lifestyle change, and that's looking at food a little differently in terms of nourishment. Yes, it's nice to gather around the table and have important family moments and memories around, and to a certain extent really indulge and enjoy it, but it's not our emotional crutch, or it's not something that, beyond just nourishing us and giving us the ability to make energy, is much more than that, and starting to think of it like that. And once you've done some fasting and you start to realize the same thing, oh, I can control my thoughts, oh, I can survive if I don't eat for a day, and you start to reset a lot of chemicals that have been really desynchronized, where you don't feel full when you should. If you don't feel satiated, you still feel hungry, and resetting those neurochemicals, those hormones like ghrelin and leptin and CCK and those types of things, can be a real life changer. But it's also now a flip of a switch, where this is now you're not just taking a supplement or doing a specific diet, but it changes your philosophy on food and life and stuff like that. That's really kind of the deeper what you hope to achieve, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a really big believer in diet variation, and I talk about that a lot. And in my membership group, my meal plan is all with diet variation. We do calorie cycling, carb cycling, intermittent fasting, but then refeeds, and just to that up and down, that the variation, I think, is so important for the hormonal system, and to be able to continue to lose weight if that's what you're trying to do, so that your body doesn't adjust to it. But I think that's
Do you feel that there's other, like, benefits out of it personally, or are you seeing with your group members in terms of thinking about food differently, or developing a different relationship with it, or knowing that it's not necessarily important as much as we used to give it value, or even feeling better when you eat better foods and feeling worse when you feel worse foods? Like, are you starting to see some of those recalibrations beyond just the variation that go deeper than that? Yeah.
Oh my gosh, so much so. And even just from a weight loss perspective, how much easier it is for somebody to do intermittent fasting rather than calorie restriction, right? With that mindset of, I'm just going to shorten my eating window, which then naturally puts you into a caloric deficit if you're trying, rather than just eating small amounts throughout the entire day. That seems to be much harder with the willpower and the mindset stuff when it comes to weight loss. And then, just that importance of when you start to eat better and fuel your system, that those cravings start to go down, and that you get to have a better relationship with food, and see that eating healthy isn't painful. I think that that's a big thing. Right.
Yeah. And you feel satiated, you feel content. And it's a different sort of evolution, if you will, where you have a different relationship with food, for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So if you have time, Joel, because I know we're a little bit over here, can we talk about testing?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm like you, I run Dutch tests. So I want you to break down why it's so important to do Dutch plus, preferably, over Dutch complete and over saliva and serum, because this is huge. Most people don't get this, and they think, oh, I'm just going to go and get my doctor to test my cortisol in the morning.
Right. Yeah, right. So the saliva one, even for just the saliva one, and they're not testing the cortisol with blood, but they're doing saliva, I feel strongly against, in terms of and not having as much good intel as you should, because it's only looking at the free fraction of the hormone. And you can have a lot of, like I said earlier, things happening outside the adrenal glands that make the cortisol look like it's low from a free fraction point of view, but really you're producing a lot. Or it could be the vice versa, where it looks like it's high, but really you're producing very little. And then to take the reductionistic approach of, oh, it's so low, I got to take these things to boost it, when meanwhile it wasn't low and it's already quite boosted in to begin with, and your body's doing things to not make it available, and you're fighting the body with the way the body wants to do things. So I'm not a huge fan of that. Obviously the blood test, I do it just to get an idea as to what is the absolute amount, just so I can see the quantity of it, which has its value, but it doesn't in terms of the rhythms. And then in terms of the circadian rhythm, it would be higher in the morning and lower at night. And then you have the Dutch. And I actually run more of the complete, to be quite honest, although I do like the plus, right? Yeah. The plus is the awakening response. And you use both a urine sample and a saliva sample. And there should be a really nice awakening response. They say usually more than double within the first 60 to 90 minutes. And that's a really good sign of what we call an axis, where you're having that awakening response, and then it falls throughout the day. But whether it's the complete that only looks at the urine samples, or it's the plus that has the urine with I think they do it every 30 minutes to be able to catch that rise and fall with the saliva when it's the plus test. That's an awesome way to look at the adrenals and see what's going on. But what I like more is looking at how much did you produce and how much is available. So that's the saliva, the free fraction versus the amount that's produced, and see if they're in alignment, or one's way more than the other. And there's a lot of reasons why they would be different. And then if that's been going on for so long, is the DHEA and the androgens and the sex hormones, are they falling? Have they fallen? Are they rising? So you can kind of get some insight on that, because everyone's going to be different. And then how well are you clearing out your estrogens for men and for women? Because you could have vital challenges with not clearing out those estrogens effectively. And that could be more problematic for women with estrogen-like cancers and so forth. If it's a phase 1 or phase 2 problem, it could be one or the other. if you're going down more androgenic pathways, a lot for women when they have PCOS issues or not, or if they have really low libido issues and they're going down another pathway, how to support it. And then you also see how much cortisol is being activated or deactivated and different reasons for that. And then you could see some organic acid markers that tell me about B vitamin status and your dopamine levels, and if your glutathione pathways are overproducing or underproducing. So it's a really good tool to be able to make some, what I call 30,000 view foot recommendations. Like I already have a lot of things in place before we do that. But like just today, I had a consult with someone, they're already on their way. But I suggested that maybe they do a little bit of support to help boost some of their androgen levels because they were so low. And that could be pregnenolone or DHEA. But I wouldn't want to have done that if I saw that their androgens were converting into estrogens, because that's only going to cause the androgens to convert more into estrogens. And some people will take estrogen blockers and say, okay, let's boost the androgens, but block it from converting into estrogen. But you want to fix the reason why it would be converting into estrogen versus just giving more and blocking it. That's playing too fancy. So it's a really great test to be able to give you some insight as to what the scoreboard of stress is placed on your body by looking at those sex hormones and coming up with a game plan right now to do some initial, what can we implement? And then let's see how well what we are implementing is working in, say, 3 to 6 months from now, and see where we're still staggered or making incredible gains or still having some small changes that we have to make still, kind of thing.
Great. And so you do offer like a Dutch Plus with 2 sessions with you, and I think it's like a 6-month thing. Is that right?
No, right now what I have is on my website I have a Dutch Plus and two visits.
Right.
And we do that. Yeah, I have that. And then that's sort of an a la carte price that I don't do a whole lot of. That's, if you want that on my website, we do that. But we're in the process of developing a membership site. And I also have a coaching program where I work with clients for 6 months to a year. And if they qualify, we give them testing, and we might use it towards a Dutch test or a DNA test, or more often than not, I want to look at those iron and blood markers to see how well your body's doing on that level. So yeah, I have different ways of working with people in that regards.
Okay. And so the testing, do you have a set tests that you do with everybody? Blood work?
No. It's a good, like, yes, I will like to look at the blood work. Like I do want to see that, right? And I will give you, the majority of people don't have all of those markers. Like they don't have ceruloplasmin, they don't have copper, they don't have vitamin A, they may not even have transferrin. The only thing they'll have is iron and ferritin, or iron, ferritin, and hemoglobin. So I want to look at those other markers, and then usually it's a Dutch test. I want to see that, but more often than not, people actually have them now. And then we do our own DNA sample. We don't, if someone has 23andMe or Ancestry, we'll use those ones. I'm not huge fans of them. The actual older they are, the better they are, because that's when they had more complete profiles. And then I'll fill in certain things that I want to see, like an organic acid test is awesome. If I suspect mold, or I want to see if there's viral loads and test for early antigen with EBV. The reason why I'm not so keen as much as I used to be on all these testing is because I know that they're not combining the food they eat with the air they breathe to make energy. And if we address those things first, a lot of the times the leaky gut, the food sensitivities, those types of things don't necessarily need it to be tested, because with the results that I get of those anyways, am I going to change my game plan from wanting to get them to fix their mechanics of energy production second? No, I'm going to want to do that first anyways, right?
Right. Oh, so great. Well, I could just keep picking your brain, Joel, but I will respect your time here because I know we're already over. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've wanted you on for so long, so I'm really happy that it finally happened. And I look forward to
Yeah.
having you
And
back.
yeah. And we have one coming up for you too. So I'm
Yeah.
excited to pick your brain on your area and your niche of the world and hear your clinical pearls and tidbits and hopefully learn a thing or two. And then whatever I have for you to share, or that's new for you, what's kind of, just as a curious thing as a listener, what is your kind of aha idea that you gotta look into more, or just sort of help whatever you're doing be that much more helpful, do you feel?
So you're putting that out there to the listeners?
Yeah. Well, for you. Like, I know, like, I always hear, like, I love interviewing my guests because they tell me all the things that they do. It's like, oh, that's a great idea. If I just work that into what I do, it already helps with the different shades of gray that I'm doing. And it's another hue that kind of just gives me some additional leverage for helping anyone. So,
Well,
yeah.
and now I'm going to be starting to look at it from a very different perspective because of what we talked about here today. Like that whole iron piece, it's so different than what I've learned from so many other practitioners about, that women are always iron deficient and copper overload. And so now I've got it in my brain. Okay, before we go jump to, here's your iron supplementation, here's your vitamin D supplementation, your B supplementation, I need to be looking at this a lot different, and figuring out how to test for these things, I think, is going to be my next thing, which is, I say it wrong, ceruloplasmin.
Ceruloplasmin. Yeah.
Ceruloplasmin.
Yeah.
RBC levels of magnesium and RBC
Right.
levels of zinc, rather
Right.
than just the standard zinc levels and selenium, which I just had done. So now I just want to get my clients to be doing those. And so we can
Right.
get this bigger picture and get a better understanding of how that all works together. So
that's great. Yeah. You'll find that there really is, if you just keep listening to that concept of, they are iron depleted, but they're not iron deficient. I think that's a good way of looking at it. They do have a problem with getting it out of their tissues, and hence they have an anemic pattern. But the anemic means that it's not in the body, and it is in the body. And I think that's a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And then I think, Joel, you need to do a practitioner's course about putting this all together, because I think a lot of what we talked about today was at that level. Right. And my listeners, they know I go deep into science. So I tell them always, put your thinking caps on for today's episode, sort of thing, because we're going to go deeper. We're going to dive into the science of some of this stuff. But a lot of what you said today, I think, should be in a coach's program, and it could be available to the layperson as well if they want that deeper dive. But just that, like, how do you pull in the genetics? What are we looking at when we're looking at people's DNA reports? And how does that relate to the adrenal system?
Right. Yeah.
Right?
I'm going to put that on the to-do list. I mean, I was a former stressed out, patient that had adrenal fatigue. So I can only do so much, but I do like that concept for sure. Is right now making a program that helps people learn this concept from a layperson point of view. So that's where we're working on right now.
Okay. Well, then next will be the coaching program for the coaches. Okay.
Right. There you go. Awesome.
I'll be your first client.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right. Well, I appreciate you having me, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yes. Thanks so much for coming on the show.